Hello, Apes, and welcome to screencast number 8, Chapter 7, Environmental Policy, Making Decisions and Solving Problems. I'm sorry I went a little bit over on that last one. I was just getting too carried away with it. So I want to go back to this, and this is how we approach environmental policy. So you can see here in this picture that this family, their home is direct line of the factory, and they're getting polluted. So the first thing that they can do is they can take this to court and they can sue the factory in court for the pollution being produced. Then from the courts, they can go to the EPA and they can petition the EPA to limit the pollution and get legislation to regulate the emissions that can be put out by the factory. And then the last part is to kind of touch the wallet of the factory makers and put in economic policies that carry out and create different incentives for reducing the pollution. So this would be how you would get an environmental policy in place. But as I said, before the legislation, lawsuits were the issue, and the beginning of these lawsuits, they had something that was called the tort law, and this is a law that deals with the harm caused to one entity by another. The word tort is a French word that means wrong or injustice. So most pollution issues were subject primarily to a nuisance law, which is a type of tort law, and individuals that suffer external cost from the pollution would seek redress these lawsuits against the polluters, and they would do this one case at a time, like they were doing in Dimock, Pennsylvania, that we had mentioned before, and that was against the Cabot Oil and Gas Company. The courts sometimes punished polluters by ordering them to stop their operations and to pay damages to the affected individuals. However, industrialization proceeded and populations grew denser and pollution became harder to avoid. So judges then became reluctant to do anything because they didn't want to hinder the industry at that point. In 1970, the U.S. Supreme Court saw the case of Boomer versus the Atlantic Cement Company. And here in this case, the court ruled that the residents of Albany, New York, who were suffering pollution from a nearby cement company, were entitled to financial compensation. But the court refused to shut down the plant. Instead, it allowed the plant to continue operating once it paid the residents. The court had calculated that the economic cost of the company and controlling its pollution were greater than the economics of the cost and the pollution to the residents. And the court based this decision on an attempt to minimize the overall costs. This ruling essentially let the market decide between whether it was right or wrong. The people concerned about the pervasive spread of pollution through the society and rulings like these showed that the tort law was no longer a viable avenue in preventing pollution. So it had to change. And that came something known as the command and control policy. And in this approach, they regulate, the regulating agency prohibits certain actions. So it sets the rules, it sets the standards, and it sets the limits for this. They will also threaten punishment for those who violate the terms. It's a very simple and direct approach to policy making. It's been used by other nations for clean air, clean water, safe workplaces, healthier neighborhoods. It's relatively safe, healthy, comfortable lives for most people. The idea is to have those safe lives. It's not totally foolproof because if there's unforeseen outcomes that they haven't taken into consideration, this approach could fail. There's a possibility that it could fail. Many people have grown disenchanted as well with the top-down nature and the command and control approach, and they've come to view government mandates as restrictions on their freedom. Regulatory policy can also fail if the government does not live up to its responsibilities, so that's a problem that they could have as well. There's interest groups that could also influence them, and these are small groups of people that seek private gain and may influence politicians. So when we see citizens looking at these interest groups, they view the policies as restrictions on their freedom from that. Also, the command and control is seen too costly as one of the problems. It's also inefficient. There are other approaches that use market forces to benefit the public. We see that in companies like Whole Foods that allow for innovative approaches to solve the problems. And they try to internalize the external costs as well. Have you heard of green taxes before? These are taxes on environmentally harmful activities. This has been a very straightforward economic policy tool that has worked very well. They tax undesirable activities to help internalize external costs by making them part of the cost of doing the business. When the business pays a green tax, it is essentially reimbursing the public for the environmental damages that it caused. Under the green taxation, if a firm owns a factory that is polluting a waterway, it would pay taxes on the amount of pollution it discharges. The more pollution, the higher the tax. So this gives firms a financial incentive to reduce pollution while allowing them the freedom to decide how best to do so. So this has been something that has worked effectively, but now what we're seeing is the companies are extending the costs on to the consumers and in the cost of the process. There hasn't been a wide support of green taxes in the United States. We have similar taxes called sin taxes, which are placed on cigarettes and alcohol. They've been used, but they haven't really been widely done. Europe, on the other hand, have adopted the polluter pays principle. And there is a debate today worldwide about whether we should implement carbon taxes, and these would be taxes on gasoline and coal-based electricity and fossil fuel intensive products in order to help fight the global climate change that's going on. Have you heard of subsidies? This is a government giveaway or cash that is a resource to encourage a particular activity that they want. So they might give you a tax break. This is a common form of a subsidy, which is relieving the tax burden on an industry or firm or individual to help reduce its expenses. So what happens is, if they use this subsidy, this tax break, to promote environmentally sustainable activities, then they won't have to pay as much of a tax. The downside is to this, it really deprives the government's treasury of funds that it would need to collect. So that has been problematic with this. Reading here. nations give about $1.45 trillion per year in harmful subsidies. And in 2002 to 2008, the U.S. fossil fuel companies received $72 billion of taxpayers' money, while renewable energy only received $29 billion. So you can see with that there are some problems with the subsidies. All right, so here's some graphics of fossil fuel industries, how they receive more subsidies than the renewable energy. You can see in the United States in A how fossil fuels, look at the huge tax break that they got in their direct spending. Carbon capture, look at how little they got. Corn ethanol, still little. Renewable energy, still little in their tax breaks that they have. And when you take a look at B, you look at it globally, and globally you can see fossil fuels, oil getting the most for that, and our renewable biofuels getting the least amount. There are other harmful environmental subsidies. Let's take a look at the General Mining Act in 1872 that we mentioned before. The companies actually extracted $500 million to $1 billion in minerals from the U.S. public lands each year, and they didn't have to pay a penny in royalties to the taxpayers who owned the land. The government was given away nearly $250 billion of the mineral resources, and the mining activities polluted more than 40% of the watersheds in the West. There was a 140-year-old law that still allows mining companies to buy land for $5 or less per acre. So that's a problem with that. The U.S. Forest Service spends $35 million of taxpayer money each year building roads to allow private timber corporations access to cut trees, which the companies then sell as a profit. So that's another example of the environmental harmful subsidies that we have in place. You know, you cut down these trees, they took hundreds of years to grow, and they serve multiple purposes. All right, you know, we're 13 minutes in. We're almost done the chapter. We'll be able to finish it up in a very short screencast. I'm going to end this one here, and we'll conclude in the next screencast.